Hello, I'm Jessie, and welcome back to the Happiness Hippie podcast. The old 3 R's were supposedly reading, writing, and arithmetic, even though only one of them actually begins with R. The phrase survived because it pointed to the basics, the skills everything else depended on. The essay we are exploring today, the 3 R's for meaningful living, read, write, count, takes that old idea and gives it a different purpose. Instead of asking what we need for an education, it asks what simple practices might help us create a life that matters. I'm joined by the author whose essay we're exploring today.
It's good to be here, Jessie. What interested me about the old 3 R's is exactly that sense of returning to basics. Meaningful living can become abstract very quickly. We talk about clarity, purpose, depth, emotional maturity, and creating a life that matters. But eventually, somebody has to ask what any of that looks like on an ordinary Tuesday. That is where reading, writing, and arithmetic became useful to me. They are not glamorous, and none of them promises transformation overnight. But each one trains something essential. Reading takes us beyond the limits of our own perspective. Writing forces us to become more precise about what is happening inside us. Arithmetic makes us face the practical reality of the life we are actually living.
I like that because the essay begins with the Happiness Hippie invitation to create a life that matters and discover depth without dogma, then immediately asks the awkward question, what do you actually do with that? It is easy to agree with an attractive philosophy, living it is something else. And starting with reading feels almost old-fashioned now, because we live in a culture where information is everywhere. We're certainly consuming words, but that does not necessarily mean we are reading in the deeper sense you describe.
No, there is an important difference between consuming information and reading with attention. Reading asks us to remain with another mind for a while. A worthwhile book can interrupt our assumptions because we cannot simply swipe away from every idea that makes us uncomfortable. That matters when we are trying to understand our own lives. Human beings have been wrestling with grief, ambition, love, mortality, belonging, and moral uncertainty for a very long time. We do not have to solve those questions from scratch. Literature, philosophy, memoir, history, and other serious writing allow us into conversations that began long before we arrived. A good book does not have to tell us what to think. In fact, I tend to value the books that resist doing that. They give us language, perspectives, and questions that make our own thinking more capable.
That idea of language is one of the strongest parts of the essay. Sometimes we're struggling with something internally, but part of the difficulty is that we cannot name it very well. Then we encounter a sentence in a book, and suddenly something that felt like fog has edges.
Yes, language gives shape to experience. Once something can be named, we can begin examining it rather than simply living inside it. That is one reason reading can support emotional clarity. It shows us that our immediate reaction is not the whole of reality. A novel may allow us to see jealousy or cowardice from a distance. A memoir can show us how another person made sense of loss. We enter another life for a while, and when we return to our own, something may have shifted. Reading also suits the idea of depth without dogma, because the page does not have to become an authority. You can read religious thought alongside secular philosophy and take both seriously without surrendering your judgment. Reading becomes an encounter rather than an instruction.
And it requires sustained attention, which is becoming valuable precisely because it is becoming harder. Serious reading does not reward the same restless state that scrolling does. You have to stay with an argument long enough to understand where it's going.
That discipline matters. We have become very good at reacting quickly and less practiced at remaining with complexity. Reading slows that process down. It gives thought time to develop before we decide whether we agree. Of course, reading alone does not make anyone wise. A person can read shelves of books and still live carelessly, but books can place better questions in the room. They enlarge the material from which we make decisions.
Then writing turns the direction inward. The line in the essay that caught me was, "If reading brings other minds into the room, writing makes us answer for our own." That seems particularly true of journaling because a thought can feel convincing until you actually try to put it into a sentence.
Absolutely. Writing exposes vagueness. We may think we know why we are angry until we try to explain it on paper. We may say that something matters deeply to us and then notice that our daily life contains almost no evidence of it. Writing gives thought a body. Once a thought is visible, it can be examined. You can ask whether it is true, whether it is fear speaking, or whether you have repeated it so often that familiarity has begun to feel like truth. That is why journaling can become much more than keeping a record of the day. It can act as an accountability mirror, not a punitive one, but an honest one. Patterns become visible because the same concern or frustration keeps appearing. After a while, it becomes harder to pretend you have not noticed.
I think that distinction is important because journaling is sometimes presented as though the act of writing itself is automatically healing. Your essay is more demanding than that. The page gives us material to work with, but we still have to be willing to look at what we have written.
Precisely. Writing down a distorted thought does not make the thought wise, but once it is written, it is no longer completely hidden. That gives us some distance from it. There is a useful movement from being immersed in an emotion to observing it. We do not stop feeling the emotion, but we become less likely to treat it as law. Something that was circling internally can now be questioned. Writing also makes our values more concrete. If I repeatedly write that health matters to me, eventually I have to look at whether my life supports that statement. If I keep saying that some piece of creative work matters, I have to notice whether I ever give it time. The page can reveal the gap between the life we describe and the life we are actually arranging.
Which brings us nicely to arithmetic, and I suspect that is the R people least expect in an essay about meaningful living. Reading and writing belong naturally in reflective territory. Arithmetic sounds like budgets and bills.
And that's exactly why it belongs there. Meaningful living cannot survive entirely in the realm of beautiful intentions. Eventually, reality has to be counted. We say that something matters, but then we have to look at what our time and money actually support. Numbers have a useful indifference to the stories we tell ourselves. If I say I have no time for something, arithmetic allows me to examine where the hours are going. If finances are creating anxiety, the numbers may show whether the fear is justified and what can realistically be changed. Arithmetic protects reflection from fantasy. It does not replace feeling or values. It gives them structure.
You describe a budget as a moral document in plain clothing. I thought that was provocative, but the more I sat with it, the more sense it made. Spending is not simply financial. It often shows which priorities have been given material support.
Yes, although I would not want to moralize every purchase. The point is that numbers reveal patterns. A person may sincerely believe freedom matters while carrying financial commitments that steadily reduce it. Someone may say that rest matters while arranging every week so tightly that rest has nowhere to occur. Without counting, we can remain vague for a very long time. Vague anxiety thrives when nothing has been measured. Arithmetic asks a basic question. What is actually happening? Sometimes the answer is reassuring. A fear that felt enormous becomes manageable once the numbers are visible. At other times, the numbers confirm that a real problem exists. That may not feel pleasant, but at least the problem becomes specific enough to work with.
That feels like the common thread between all three practices. Each one reduces a different kind of vagueness. Reading challenges the limits of our existing perspective. Writing exposes what is happening internally. Counting tells us whether our intentions have any footing in reality.
I think that is the heart of it, Jesse. The three practices correct different weaknesses and they strengthen one another. Suppose someone reads something that makes them reconsider how they're spending their life. Writing gives them a place to explore why the idea matters. Then, arithmetic can show whether the current structure of their days actually supports the change they claim to want. The insight moves from another person's words through personal reflection and finally into something measurable. That is meaningful living becoming practical. It stops being a philosophy we admire and becomes something we can observe in the shape of a week.
The essay offers a very modest way to begin. Read a few pages from something worth your attention, write about what it stirred or what you are wrestling with, then look honestly at one number that matters in your life. I like the modesty of that because it avoids turning the 3 R's into another productivity system. The purpose is not to create a complicated ritual that becomes one more obligation.
Exactly. I would rather someone read 5 pages with attention than race through a book because they're trying to complete a target. The same applies to journaling. One honest paragraph may be more useful than pages written simply to maintain a streak. Arithmetic can also remain simple. You do not need to turn your whole life into a spreadsheet. You may only need to know how much time a commitment is consuming or what an expense is actually costing over a year. The point is contact with reality, not obsessive measurement. Meaningful living is often less dramatic than people expect. It grows through repeated acts of attention. We read something that enlarges us, write enough to understand our response, and then make sure our real life has some connection to what we say matters.
That also fits the larger happiness hippie idea of creating space for happiness. We often assume change has to begin with a major reinvention, but sometimes a better life begins with returning to practices that help us pay attention. Reading can slow down a mind that has been living on fragments. Writing can bring order to thoughts that have been circling without resolution. Counting can replace a vague worry with something we can finally see clearly. None of that is spectacular, but it is useful.
And usefulness matters. There's already enough language around personal growth that sounds impressive while asking very little of us. The 3 R's appeal to me because they're ordinary and available. They also keep responsibility with the individual. A book can offer wisdom, but you still have to decide what you think. A journal can reveal something uncomfortable, but you decide what to do with it. Numbers can show you reality, but they can't make the choice for you. There is no doctrine hiding inside the method. It's simply a way of becoming more informed about the world, more understandable to yourself, and more realistic about the structure of your own life.
Perhaps that is why the old phrase survives so well in this new form. The original 3 R's were treated as foundations because they made further learning possible. These 3 can serve a similar purpose for an examined life. Read because your own perspective is not enough. Write because your inner life becomes easier to understand when you give it language. Count because intention needs contact with reality before it can become a life. Take up a book, open a notebook, face the numbers, then return to the practice tomorrow, not because you are trying to perfect yourself, but because a life that matters is built through attention to what matters. If today's conversation resonated and you want more perspective on emotional clarity or meaningful living, begin at the Our Approach page at happinesshippie.com. And please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for being part of this community. We will talk again soon.